Good day to you. At some point today, you're going to want to get something to eat, I assume. And you can have anything in the world that you want, right? Well, not really. You get up to the counter wherever you are, whether it's Wawa or the University Center, and you may not have the money that you want to get exactly what you want. Or you may be with other people and you're reluctant to eat something that looks bad in front of them, like 3 bags of chips. Or you don't have much time, so you can't really wait for something to be prepared, so you got to order something that can be made right now or is already made. There's a lot of influences on what you can eat. There's a lot of ways that what you eat is regulated. And that's what today's chapter is on. It's on the regulation of media, and it's my own personal favorite thing to talk about in comparative media because the regulation of media to me is so interesting across the world in terms of the way that it's done differently. And what we're talking about here is the trunk of the tree. Yeah, it's that part that you lean up against when you're at the media system. It holds the rest of the structure up. It's the part that's so present to you. It's the solid part of the tree. And that's the way that regulation functions in a media system. And so what we're talking about today has to do with the way that media is regulated, or media are regulated, and ultimately the content and how that appears to be different. And I just want to say before we get going that broadcasters traditionally are regulated more than print media. It's kind of a silly argument for that serves as the basis for that. It's called the scarcity of spectrum space. And it was really developed, this line of argument, long before we had cable television, satellite, and the internet. And it basically said that there are only so many spots on the FM band, or so many spots on the AM band, or so many spots on the TV spectrum. And so if you get to have a TV channel, you have a privileged position. And there's not enough room for other channels that are close to you. And so because of that, because you have a privileged position, you need to be regulated. Well, it's still the case today for broadcasters. What we're talking about here, when we're talking about the various influences on media that can affect media, we have government-related agencies. Some of them are directly within government. Others, like the FCC here in the U.S., are independent from the government, but still strongly influenced by the government, so they're government-related. Then we also have media organizations themselves. You know, when you belong to professional organizations like the National Association of Broadcasters, you are to some extent influenced by what you can do at your TV or your radio station. So, for example, there's the whole idea of accepting a lot of money for political ads right now. Both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are raising tons of money to spend on advertising, and media organizations are pressured to accept that because every other media organization is doing it. That's what the professional association likes to see. It keeps the advertising model as the basis for funding TV. So there are media organizations and professional organizations, some of which have codes of conduct. The journalists have a professional code of conduct that says things like you cannot accept gifts of over $25 from anybody as a journalist, because then you may be biased if you ever have to cover them in a crime-related story. So we've got media organizations. Then we also have citizen groups. It's another impactful audience, or another impactful group on the way that media are regulated. Here in the U.S., we have a citizens group called the Parents Television Council. And they are very against a lot of content that they think creates poor imagery for young people. So, for example, shows that would glorify cosmetic surgery, that's something that, make it look like it's an option in life rather than a last resort to reconstruct yourself from a car accident, for example. Instead, go have your nose fixed because you don't like it. That's the kind of thing that the Parents Teachers Council as a citizens group tries to regulate media on. Then we also have advertisers. Advertisers regulate media content. Disney, which owns ABC, is sure not going to allow, let me back out of that example. You'll find that a lot of soft drink companies, Coke, Pepsi, Mountain Dew, and etc., they buy a lot of ads on TV shows. So why is it that you don't really have TV shows, at least dramas, depicting sodas as being something that's very unhealthy for you? Which it is. It's full of white sugar. It's full of artificial dye. It's very, very fattening. You want to lose weight and cut soda out of your diet, you'll notice the results right away. But you don't find this portrayed on sitcoms. Why? because they know that they're going to irritate the soda advertisers, and the soda advertisers will pull out. There's not necessarily the soda advertisers on the phone saying, hey, do not portray soda in a bad way in your TV show. No, it's not like that. It's just sort of implicitly understood. And then also you have audiences. That's the final regulatory group, audiences. If you don't like a TV show, you're not going to watch it. If the TV show doesn't have an audience, then it gets canceled. Playboy magazine recently changed from showing nude females for the most part to just depicting females in terms of fashion. And why is that? It's because the audience left Playboy who were interested in that. They started looking at naked people on the internet. And so it became a situation where Playboy had to re-engineer itself because its audience regulated the fact that that kind of content that they used to offer, naked content, was not desirable anymore. Now, before we go into the individual countries, I want to mention the EU here, the European Union. It's that consortium that a lot of countries belong to. It's the one that Britain is exiting out of. That's what Brexit refers to. And the EU has some regulatory control over the countries that belong to it. Particularly in two areas, you'll find minutage, which is something that's talked about in this chapter quite a bit, and watershed. Minutage refers to the amount of minutes maximum that you can use for advertising on TV or radio. And watershed refers to that time period in the evening when you can get a little bit looser with your content. You can show more things sexually. You can use more foul language because it's assumed that children are in bed. So let's now move into those three countries that belong to the European Union, France being one of them. And in France, you have the state as a very big operator and regulator in the media marketplace. In part, that's because of France's experience in World War II, having been run over by Germany twice. And so the state wants to be strong, and it's going to make sure that it makes sure that media does not have any kind of role in the downfall of France ever again. So the state is both a creator of content, it's also a regulator of content. And one of the things that France is big on as a regulatory ideal is political pluralism. And that means that you have to have a wide range of opinion on radio and TV. If you want to establish yourself as a brand new radio station, you've got to be adding to the mix. So in France, you have radio that's anarchy radio, you have Jewish radio, you have conservative radio, you have liberal radio, you have communist radio. Now, I don't know whether this is still as up-to-date as when I wrote this item, because France is now banning the burqa on beaches. That's the Muslim dress, and that's not necessarily showing political pluralism or religious pluralism anyway. But in terms of when I wrote this book, political pluralism was one of the regulatory requirements. Next up is protection of minors. You find that this is the case for Sweden and for Britain as well. Protection of minors, making sure that minors are not exposed to really lewd programming. Now, having said that, you will see nudity in French television. You'll see it in advertisements, believe it or not. And you'll see it, of course, in dramatic programming and movies. But what you are prohibited from doing is very, very graphic and very specific, is showing penetration of genitalia. That's to protect minors. Also, there's a protection of the French language as a regulation in France, to make sure that the French language doesn't get overwhelmed by the English language. So there are actually quotas on the amount of imported TV and radio programs, mostly aimed at the US, but also Britain, to keep those down to a certain level so that the French people don't end up losing their language. A word like the computer, they don't want people saying le computer. That would be an Anglicization. I don't know if I'm making up a word there, but English taking over the French language. Instead, they had the ordinateur. It's a completely different word for computer to make sure that the French language has autonomy and sovereignty. And then you have minutage. Ad minutage is a regulation in France as well, where you can only have a certain limit number of ads per hour. You can find out what that number is in the book. It's different for France and Britain and Sweden, but the idea is you can't just have as many advertising minutes as you want, because it squeezes the programming. If you ever, for example, watch a TV newscast in the United States and you hear somebody interviewed, a politician, oftentimes that their soundbite is cut off. Whatever they say doesn't sound like their full sentence. It's just one small example of how the programming is constantly being squeezed in the United States, because if you take a half-hour programming, anywhere between 8 and 12 minutes of that half hour is advertising. So the alternate way to look at that is 22 minutes is the actual content, is the news program or the sitcom or the drama or the reality show. 22 minutes. So that means you're always compressing that programming to get what you want to get in that 22 minutes that you have available. Moving on to Sweden now. In Sweden, you have one difference between this country and the other countries that's kind of remarkable for newspapers, and that is all newspapers have to be licensed. You don't find licensing in any other country, I believe, in the book where newspapers have to be licensed. Of course, radio and TV stations do. They're broadcasters, but not newspapers. Having said that, though, Sweden is not a country that is controlling newspaper content. They just want to have a chain of responsibility. If somebody writes a story that's irresponsible, they want to be able to say, who is the person at this newspaper who's responsible for that? Also, advertising is strictly regulated more than other countries. Advertising is really kept down to a low, not just in media, by the way, in general life. There's a law in Sweden that you can't have any commercial advertisers, billboards, etc. on the coast. So if you go around Sweden, the coast, it looks like it did in the 1400s. No billboards, no such thing as a New Jersey boardwalk with all those, blinking lights and audio advertisements playing for pizza. None of that in Sweden. And you also find that in media as well. They try to keep advertising really low in the mix. They feel that when you introduce the profit motive and commercialization into media content, it starts to corrupt what people are able to learn, what people are able to appreciate, etc. I'll have more to say about that when we get to the chapter on content. Another area of regulation in Sweden that's pretty strong is alcohol and drugs, but mostly alcohol. You're not even allowed to advertise certain alcohols that are over a certain volume of alcohol in them. It has to be like less than 4% for you to be able to advertise on TV. Part of this is because Sweden does have a big problem with drinking. The Viking mentality is something that Swedes talk about. Drink till you drop. And they're trying to guard against that. And also Sweden has winters where many people are spending their entire winter in the dark. So, because it's so far north, and that leads some people to believe that's one of the reasons that alcoholism and drinking is so strong. So there's a lot of regulations about alcohol. Sexual content is like France, regulated, no penetration. But I've seen a lot of Swedish TV that would be considered to be pornographic by American standards. It actually shows people having sex. It doesn't show close-ups, but it's part of the plot. Husband and wife come home, and the plot includes them making love. They're going to show body parts. They're going to show a woman's breast being squeezed, for example. This is Swedish content. You also find that in France as well. Violence is also regulated in Sweden. They are very strong against having overly violent, gratuitous violent programming. A movie like Casino was actually banned from Sweden. I don't know if that will still be the case today, but Sweden is very big on keeping violence out of media programming. Unless, of course, it occurs in the context of war news reporting. Then we've got the UK, moving on to that now. And in the UK, you have the strongest, most powerful, most comprehensive regulator out of all the countries. It's called Ofcom, the Office of Communication. And it really, really makes broadcasters live up to a lot of expectations. All broadcasters are considered to be public service broadcasters. Over on the print side, you don't have any constitutional guarantees guaranteeing freedom of the press like you do in the other countries. Kind of interesting, but you actually have the freest press that I've ever seen. They used to be known as the Red Tops. They still are. Those are the tabloid newspapers in Britain, and they have red banners across the top. The Sun is the most important one, owned by the News Corporation, same company that owns Fox. And you find scathing reports on mostly celebrities, following them all over the world to try and catch them in affairs or catch them looking really, really heavy and out of shape, or trying to catch them smoking cigarettes and drinking. And, you have a kind of a license to talk about anything. I don't mean license in the literal sense, but you have a freedom, is what I'm trying to say, in Britain to report on almost anything. The newspaper reporting is very vivid in Britain, let me tell you. Anyway, back to broadcasters, the areas that they're regulated in, you have ad minutage, again, just like France and Sweden. Also, you have very strict terms on the use of the word free. You can't say free if there is an entry fee. You can't say that something is free if you have to be 18 years old to get it. There's a lot of restrictions like that in Britain. Also, protection of children is very strongly regulated. I forgot to mention this about Sweden, but in Sweden, because we're talking about protection of children, you're not even allowed to have children in advertisements, period. It's seen as exploitation of young people who cannot make that decision for themselves whether to be in an ad. And you have a similar situation in the UK. You can have children, but you have to have a separation between an advertisement for children and children's programming. Teletubbies, you probably recall, and Blue's Clues, if you remember those shows, imported from Britain. We had an American version here. Those are programs that you cannot run advertisements for children's cereal, children's clothes, children's games, right next to those shows. You can't have those shows and then in the middle of them have those children's advertising. So it's very, very strongly regulated there. Also, production quotas are regulated in Britain. What this is about is spreading around the independent production houses who produce TV programs, so that it's not just up to the big studios. There have to be independent producers that are allowed to produce programs, and that's to keep variety and diversity in the content that ends up on television. Now moving to the U.S., as we know, the U.S. has a libertarian, for the most part, philosophy, so the government is kind of a weak regulator compared to other regulatory bodies. The regulation comes out of the FCC, the Federal Communication Commission, and Congress. And perhaps the area that is most strongly regulated in the American media environment, which you could also consider to be authoritarian, is indecency. You are very, very heavily punished for committing indecent programming in the U.S. If you say the word fuck on television, that could net you a $315,000 fine, whereas you'll hear profanity on British and Swedish radio all the time. If it's in the song, it's considered part of the content that's natural. And also the thinking is, if that's the way people talk in life, not that they should, not that it's appropriate. I certainly don't talk that way very much unless I stub my toe or something like that. But if it's going to be talked about in Europe, then why not let media reflect that? In the U.S., no way. Same with nudity. You just cannot have nudity. You end up with a big fine. So indecency, obscenity, profanity, they all go together, very strongly regulated in the U.S. Next up is non-commercial broadcasters. It is strongly regulated. No advertisements on those stations whatsoever. Very different from France. You can have advertisements on public broadcasters there. But in the U.S., NPR, National Public Radio, also PBS, the public broadcasting system, that's on the TV side. You air one advertisement and you might be shut down. Even WESS Radio has those restrictions as well. WESS Radio, the university's radio station, can do underwriting, can do sponsorships where we say portions of this program are brought to you by X business located at X address on Main Street, but you can't say things like they have the best, the biggest, the brightest. You can't say come on down and get yours today. No calls to action. In other words, very strongly regulated non-commercial broadcasters. And children's programming is regulated to some extent. It's basically forcing TV broadcasters to air some hours of children's programming, otherwise they wouldn't. It's one of the problems of commercialism. Commercialism does not support airing a lot of TV programming that's geared towards children. They're not a big advertising demographic. So in the USA, the FCC mandates that you have to offer X amount of hours on children's TV programming. Going on to Mexico now. In Mexico, you have some similarities to the U.S., but you also have a situation where they're still coming out of that long period of 71 years of one political party and a lot of corruption and a lot of authoritarianism, and so regulation is looser in Mexico. One thing that's similar, though, regulation-wise, is no ads on public broadcasters. We saw that in the U.S. Then also they have this very elaborate, questionable programming scheme where there are different classifications of what you can show. So you can even advertise for cigarettes in Mexico as long as it's during a certain hour on television, as an example. Also in Mexico, the government mandates that it has its own hour of programming, national hour, and the states also get their own hour. So they get to take over radio and TV for a certain set amount of time on the weekends, for the most part, and broadcast messages that the government would like to see broadcast about eradicating disease, about lifting itself out of poverty. There's still a lot of poverty in Mexico. So that's interesting. The government has its own hour on radio and TV. Then you also have criticism of government is regulated in Mexico. You are allowed to criticize government. You didn't used to be able to do that. However, you cannot demean a particular office holder. So you can't. The president right now is President Nieto. You can say that he is incompetent. You can say he's uneducated if you're a radio or TV reporter or a newspaper reporter, but you can't call him an idiot. You can't call him a moron. That's going over the line. That's criticism of government that demeans the person and demeans the office. Next up is China. The country in the book that has the most regulation is definitely China. You got the Communist Party in charge of that. They even have an agency called the Ministry of Propaganda. Here in the U.S., we consider propaganda to be a bad term. In China, that's just a very factual term. It's neutral. It's not considered to be bad. So you've got propaganda, the Ministry of Propaganda, and they regulate the internet. It's the only country in the book that's strongly regulating the internet. Like I mentioned before, you try to bring up Facebook, you can't do it in China. You just get web page not available because you have to go to China's own Facebook group, if whatever the name of it is. I can't remember. So in China, internet is strongly regulated and certainly is a place for criticizing government. No way. In fact, that's the next area that you find media regulated across all media, newspapers as well in China, and that is no criticism. Well, I won't say no criticism of government. You're not allowed to criticize the national government. However, China does allow some criticism of lower level positions in municipal governments because they see that as a way to root out corruption, people taking bribes and whatnot for projects. And so some smaller level criticism is allowed, but not of the Communist Party, not of the national government. China also regulates what it calls unappetizing advertising. Not all advertising is allowed. No hemorrhoid cream, no tampon advertisements, probably no Viagra advertisements. These are seen as unseemly kinds of ads. And then you have culturally appropriate content as an area that's regulated. Culturally appropriate content means that the content should be sort of in line with what I talked about, tasteful, but also it can't be too much foreign programming coming in. You can't have this idea of cultural imperialism taking place from the Chinese point of view where every night you turn on television, it's all American TV shows. So culturally appropriate program is trying to block that out, keep things Chinese, keep things focused on what people are learning, how people are improving their lives, how people are spiritually connecting with the world, etc. Next up is Ghana. Ghana is very wary of regulation because of its past, its war-torn past. And so you have a government being very reluctant to get involved in regulating because the country doesn't want to go back to those days where government controlled everything. You do still have the government owning the airways, and then they license those airwaves out to radio and TV broadcasters. The areas there are some attempts at regulation, even though it's not necessarily enforced strongly. Number one is political reporting. You can't just completely badmouth and trash the other political party. You have to provide some kind of balance between the positives and the negatives in what you're reporting. As part of that, you have the rejoinder is regulated. A rejoinder is a citizen is allowed to respond to accusations. If a newspaper reports that a citizen was drunk or a citizen was acting out of control in a violent manner, or a citizen stole money, then the citizen gets to write a newspaper article, gets to be interviewed by the broadcaster. It's called a rejoinder. And that's to stop the government from being able to demonize a particular person who is maybe in opposition to the government and maybe weakening the government's authority. That's what that's there for. And then you have broadcasting standards, and broadcasting standards is referring to tasteful programming as well. So you're not going to find nudity on Ghana television because those broadcasting standards prohibit against that. Finally, that takes us to Lebanon. In Lebanon, you have another similar situation, very weak government there and because of the civil war. And you have a lot of laws on the book for regulation, but you don't have much policing ability in Lebanon because the media are more powerful than the government in many ways. So some of the areas that they try to have regulations in are in domestic programs, again, making sure that programs are produced in Lebanon. So what you actually will have is they will take American TV shows and then they'll just recreate them with Lebanese actors. So I wouldn't be surprised, for example, The Big Bang Theory is in Lebanon, but with Lebanese actors. And it comes off as being more primitive and doesn't have the same production standards, but it's adhering to this regulation of keeping programming domestic. Also, you have political opinion. Political opinion, you have to be licensed to be a political opinion disperser. You can't just start your own TV and radio station up and newspaper and do politics. You're either licensed as a political newspaper or you're not a political newspaper. You're licensed as a political TV station or you're not. And even then, you're supposed to have diversity of opinion and balance so that Lebanon doesn't descend back into a civil war again. Advertising minutage is also regulated, although it's not necessarily followed. And finally, religious programming is regulated. You can't be, you cannot be bad-mouthing others' religions. You can't be proselytizing in an offensive way. That means preaching, fire and brimstone in a way that bad-mouths the Christian religion if you're Muslim, or if you're Christian, bad-mouthing the Muslim religion or other kinds of religions, Jewish Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, etc. It's always a very delicate balance in Lebanon because you have so many, not just religious factions, but religions that are very, very fundamentalist religions, very adamant stances about what is right and wrong, and what other religions are not following that is right or wrong. So Lebanon's trying to balance that all the time. So there you have it. That's regulation, and as you'll see as we head on to the next chapters, regulation is going to be influencing very much the way that media systems look, shape, and feel. Have a great day.